All right. So, like I said in the course overview PowerPoint, we're going to start before we get into our living religions into talking about the more or less defunct or dead ancient religion of the Greeks. And so the first kind of ancient Greek work or ancient Greek author I'm asking you to read a selection from is this figure of Hesiod. And I don't really think it matters if you read the selection, the Theogony and Works and Days before you watch this PowerPoint or after. It might be better if you kind of take a crack at reading the work first and then coming to this PowerPoint. But I think they complement each other in whatever order you take them. So like I said, I want to start with the ancient Greeks because I want to illustrate how, particularly amongst the polytheistic religions that we'll be talking about, the religions that believe in many gods, have a lot of similarities with kind of polytheistic systems that go back centuries. And I'm singling out the ancient Greeks as an example of an ancient but now defunct religion that has a lot of these same tenets. So a little bit about the figure that I'm asking you to read. So Hesiod. He's probably less known than the figure of Homer. I'm guessing some of you in high school or otherwise tackled the Odyssey or the Iliad from Homer. He's better known. But Hesiod was a poet that kind of emerges in ancient Greek culture around the same time as Homer. We don't know much about him. Like Homer himself, the best we can do is describe him as semi-legendary. I would probably say most historians figure there was probably a Hesiod, or at least a poet that we later give the name Hesiod at this time. But that's not really a question we have to consider here. But along with Homer, whoever Hesiod and Homer were, they are often credited as being the beginning point of Greek literature, of Greek poetry. And in terms of Hesiod, certainly the beginnings of the more formalized Greek religion, theology. And so the two poems that I'm asking you to read, obviously in English translation, are his Theogony and Works and Days. And so I want to go through these briefly and kind of highlight what Hesiod is up to. And again, ask some of these basic questions and answer some of these basic questions about polytheistic systems that we will kind of carry with us into the coming weeks. So, uh, look at this. Look at this slide. What a mess. Again, don't be frightened. I'm not asking you to be responsible for this huge, dizzying mass of names. I show you this slide because it's kind of dizzying. What you see here is a genealogy of the gods and kind of a map of the creation of the world that Hesiod gives us in the Theogony. And you just see at a glance how complex it is. Hesiod begins his story with a very simple kind of universe. There's just a void above, which the Greeks called chaos. Gaia, the earth, is there. Tartarus, the underworld, is beneath the earth. And then into the picture comes Eros, which is sexual desire, the libido. And when Eros comes into the picture, these gods, which you can recognize, they're gods and goddesses, but they are also part of the natural universe. This is very common in systems like these. If you go way back to the beginning of the mythologies and legends and stories, gods and goddesses are often synonymous with nature itself, and so the earth is a goddess. The abyss is a god. Chaos, the void above, would technically be a masculine deity. And once Eros gets into the picture, these gods start to mate with each other and they produce children. And as you go down through the lines of the generations, a couple of things particularly happen. The earth becomes more distinct. We get like the sea, the sky, and mountains. We get kind of other aspects that have to do with kind of time and human culture, death, sleep, strife, deceit, distress. You can notice they're kind of very dark. Retribution, blame, affection, aging. They start to kind of shape the universe along a more kind of humanistic lines. As we go down, the gods themselves start to separate themselves from nature. So we get distinct gods like, let me see, pick one here, like Aphrodite, the goddess of sex, the goddess of love. Gods like Tethys, who are a kind of a distinct personality and not necessarily representative parts of nature. Now you see that the nature part still goes on. Oceanos, a god which is synonymous with, we get our word ocean from it. Helios is a god, but he's also the sun. And as we get down to the last of the generations, we start to see some names that maybe you recognize from some familiarity with Greek mythology. Zeus and Poseidon and Hades. And you see what happens is that Zeus is a sky god, but he's not the sky. Poseidon is the god of the sea, but he's not the sea. Hades is a god of the underworld, but he's not the underworld itself. So we can see that kind of chaos, or the sky and the earth and the sea and the abyss that were synonymous with these names, with these gods. These gods were these things. By the time we get to this later generation, these gods have become more humanoid, and they're separate from the things that they represent. And so, like I said, this is a very common kind of chain, a very common story that you see in many polytheistic systems, both living and dead religions, where gods are part of nature at the beginning. Gods come about when they mate with each other and have children, and those children also make the earth and nature more complex as we go down. But as you get down through the generations, you have gods that are separate from nature. Now, scholars have kind of pointed out that what you see in Hesiod's Theogony, in the story, in the narrative, is you see these kind of four stages happening. So the name of the work itself, Theogony, in Greek just means the birth of the gods. That's one of the key things that's happening. So Theogony, gods are born. And as gods are born, you get cosmogony, which is the birth of the cosmos. And so, as we just saw, as gods are part of nature, as gods are born, naturally, nature is born. And then what invariably happens in stories like these, again, this is not just a Greek thing. You find this in Middle Eastern mythology. There's hints of it in Egyptian mythology. Around the world, we get theomachy, another Greek phrase which means the war of the gods. So what happens is these generations of gods kind of start to bump up against each other and not trust each other. And so one generation seeks to overthrow the previous generation, and that's exactly what happens. And so the major conflict, as you'll see, or maybe if you've already read it, you saw, is you have these generations of the Titans coming into conflict with the next generation of Olympians. And after the dust settles from that battle, we have the Olympians in charge, and then we get what we call succession. How does the war stop? How do you stop from just the next generation going to war with the previous generation once again? And so in the Theogony, Zeus and his brothers and sisters figure out a method to kind of bring things under control and to set up a system in which the Olympians kind of rule the roost. And so as I have down here, we might even boil down the Theogony as it seeks to answer the question: how do the Olympian deities, that's Zeus, Poseidon, Hades, his sisters, their children, come to power, and how did Zeus come to be their ruler? How did it come to be for the Greeks that Zeus comes to be the guy in charge, and why did it happen that he wasn't overthrown? Now, again, we don't have space to go into this. It's a really complex story. There's lots of interesting kind of Greek mythological tales. Again, if you're interested, I teach a Greek mythology class here at GRCC, and we go much deeper into these kinds of things. But more or less for the remainder of kind of Greek mythology and Greek theological culture, Zeus is the chief god, and he never loses that position. Now, the second work that I'm asking you to read, his Works and Days, is also it's kind of an odd piece of poetry, because it presents itself, as I have here, as kind of a farmer's almanac. It doesn't present itself as really theological on the face of it at all. It's Hesiod, and he's writing this story, he's writing this poem for his brother Perseus. No, not Perseus, not the famous Greek hero who kills Medusa. This is just Hesiod's brother, who Hesiod presents as lazy. He doesn't want to work. He doesn't want to plow the fields. He doesn't want to do the hard, gut-wrenching, hand-breaking, back-breaking work that it takes simply to survive. And so Hesiod tells him, no, life is awful. Hesiod is very pessimistic about the universe and the place of humanity in it. That's a hallmark of kind of early Greek poetry. And he tells him to Perseus, you have no choice. If you want to survive, you got to work, and that's all there's left to you. And then he kind of goes back and he says, well, let me explain to you how things got so bad. And he tells particularly kind of two famous stories that explains this: the myth of the five ages and the famous myth of Pandora. And put together, those two stories Hesiod uses to explain why life for humanity in his generation and his brother's generation is so awful and so difficult. And so, like I said, he has a very cynical, very pessimistic view of the universe and of human progress. He's very cynical about the role of gods in their relationship to humanity. There's not, if you look at kind of the vast majority of Greek mythology, for your everyday average human being, the gods, generally speaking, are not on your side. The gods are self-interested. They've got their own thing going on. They're pursuing their own pleasures, their own lusts, their own ego, their own reputation, their own power. And if they can use a human being to further that, they will. And the kind of the stories where a god takes a kind of benevolent, kindly interest in a human being are by far the exception. And not the rule. So Hesiod tries to explain this to some degree of why life is so difficult. So it's kind of a theology of humankind, a theology of mankind. So the first of these two stories, the myth of the five ages, also tells a story that we see in other cultures as well. The Romans had a version of this story. There's a version of this story in the book of Daniel in the Jewish scriptures, what Christians call the Old Testament. This idea that if you go back to the beginning, things were great. There was a utopia. There was a small window of time when humanity and the gods lived in peace and harmony together, but it does not last. An era where human beings lived in harmony with nature. You didn't have to plow and plant and sweat. Nature just freely gave of what it had to human beings. But as we go down through these ages, human beings turn away from the gods. They start to stop making their sacrifices. They start to treat each other poorly. They start to fight. Destruction, war, famine comes into the picture. And you can see as the ages decline in the value of their metals, from gold to silver to bronze, things get worse and worse and worse and worse. So it's a kind of a story of a fall. So many people have kind of compared this as a kind of Greek idea of like the Garden of Eden story, which I'm just guessing that many of you are familiar with. The Garden of Eden in Jewish and Christian tradition, and even partially in the Islamic tradition too, was a place of perfection until Adam and Eve disobey God, and then they're kicked out, and things get worse and worse and worse. So it's a broadly speaking, it's a similar kind of story. Now, what's interesting in the Greek story, there's this kind of brief uptick in the graph. There's a heroic age where suddenly things, for a brief moment in time, are great again. This is often, although Hesiod is not all that detailed about this, we assume that this is the age of the great Homeric heroes, the stories of the Trojan War, where you have heroes like Odysseus and Achilles and Hector and Ajax and such. This is an era where suddenly, men were men again, and human beings showed great promise and being almost close to gods themselves. But of course, humanity is deeply flawed, inherently broken, so they throw that all away too, and that plunges us down into the Iron Age, which is just the bleakest of the bleak. Hesiod says something like, there once was a day where you could go out with your plow and you could plant for a day, and you'd be set for food and sustenance for the year. One day, and the other 364 days you were set. But he says now the way things are so broken that you have no choice. Again, he's addressing his brother Perseus, to break your back every day. Now, again, Hesiod isn't all that clear on kind of what exactly he's trying to say. So we have to bring some interpretation. And so one of the interpretations, and that's why I put the question mark here because this is just an idea, is that this myth explains kind of how human beings are internally broken and kind of have the seeds of their own destruction built into their own character in humanity. And so human beings are going to throw it away. That's just how we're built. For the Greeks, the cardinal sin, we might call it, was hubris. This word survives into English, and it's usually kind of translated as kind of excessive pride. But for the Greeks, what it really meant was kind of going too far. Thinking that you are God, believing too much in yourself, not knowing your place, not knowing yourself, and when you don't know those things, you act hubristically. You act beyond what you're supposed to do, and you invite the destruction. The Greeks had this notion that hubris invites nemesis. So if you act hubristically, you're inviting nemesis, a counteracting force visited upon you by the gods that's just going to bring you down. And so human beings are hubristic by nature. They are lazy by nature, and ultimately, as Hesiod puts to his brother, the bent toward idleness overcomes the willingness to work. Now, the second story, which again I'm just guessing, probably some of you have heard of, the myth of Pandora, is also kind of a piece of this story. And in trying to kind of work this into kind of a working theology, which again Hesiod never really presents this as kind of, yes, I'm explaining, my fellow Greeks, your theology to you. This is an interpretation that the myth of Pandora explains then external evil. So if the myth of the Five Ages says, well, human beings are eternally broken, well, where do the external evils like disease and famine and natural disasters and where do those things come from? You might look to the myth of Pandora to explain that. So in this famous story, the gods see human beings as a threat. They see them as kind of a next generation that could rise up, become so numerous they could overthrow the gods. And at this point, kind of all of humanity, as it's getting more powerful and more complex, is exclusively male. You'll see there's lots of good old-fashioned misogyny in these early tales. You find this again lots of these ancient cultures, which are where the system of the gods is what we would call patriarchal one, where the chief god is a sky masculine god, and the Greeks are no exception. Again, this should not surprise us. And so Zeus decides, what's the worst thing I can think of to mess up this powerful humanity that's gaining in complexity and could threaten me. He says, well, I'll send them a woman. And so the gods get together and they create Pandora, whose name means Pan, all, Dora, gift. She's the all gift one. And the idea is that all of the gods and goddesses kind of put their own little touches on the creating of this first woman. And so Zeus says, well, if I send them this woman, men will be endlessly distracted and they will forget about threatening me and gaining in complexity. So if I send them a woman, mankind will be kept under my thumb, under their own thumb, forever. And so Pandora is sent down to a titan by the name of Epimetheus. He's the brother of Prometheus. And a little Greek helps here. Epimetheus, his name means afterthought. The idea that he only understands things long after they happen. His brother Prometheus, his name means forethought, before thought. He knows the future. Prometheus is the smart brother. He knows things before they happen. Epimetheus is the idiot brother. He only understands things after they happen. So Zeus knows this is the perfect guy to be the conduit for this curse on mankind. So he gives Pandora to Epimetheus, and Epimetheus unwittingly brings it down to humanity, where Pandora is meant to be a kind of a curse for humanity. Now again, like you notice that again, there is kind of a raw kind of male as kind of representing the good, original, happy, natural state of mankind, and female as kind of a corrupted form of that. Sometimes Pandora is called kind of the Greek Eve, in that Eve is created in the Jewish scriptures as kind of as a companion to Adam, not as a curse for mankind, but she's created after the masculine, from the masculine. So, I think there's some kind of broad overlap here. Now, of course, probably you've heard of Pandora and her box. She opens up this box and she unleashes all of these external evils onto mankind. Famine, hunger, disease, all this kind of stuff that combined with the internal evils explains kind of why life is so horrible for people in Hesiod's own age. Now, you'll notice if you read the translation I gave you, one, it's a jar, not a box. And Pandora's given there's no motivation. There are later versions, there's dozens of versions of the Pandora story that come later that say, well, she's given this box and she's told, don't open it, but she's too curious. So she opens it anyway, or she, again, her greed, her own personal failings lead her to open the box. Hesiod doesn't have any of that. It's just suddenly the jar is there and she takes the lid off and these things fly out. That's it. It's a really skeletal narrative. Um, and so it's puzzled readers. What is this? Why is it a jar and not a box? And one of the really interesting theories is that the kind of jar that Hesiod mentions there, was a particular kind of jar called an amphora, which later becomes kind of a symbol for womankind itself. It kind of has a stereotypical kind of hourglass figure shape, a more feminine shape. And it's thought that the jar then represents kind of womankind. You also notice that when she slams the lid back on, the only good thing that was in the jar stays in there, hope. And that too is a teasing image. And so some have taken that, well, this is just amping up the cynicism, amping up the pessimism, and that only all the bad things fly out, and we're not even given hope. Others have seen it say that if the jar represents womankind, then hope remains in, we might call, the womb of the jar, the womb of the woman. And what he's suggesting is that just like with that heroic age, is that things look bleak now, but every generation that is birthed from woman, that is quote unquote, or so to speak, released from the jar, it has the potential of raising the bar, of restoring hope. Every generation kind of carries within it the possibility of hope. I like that. You'll often see Greek stories tend to be very pessimistic, but there's often kind of this small sliver of a silver lining that we can cling to. This might be one of them. All right, I end with just kind of some ancient Greek art here. This is a creation of Pandora. We have, this is likely Zeus over here overseeing the proceedings. This is the god Hermes, the famous messenger god you recognize, was easily recognizable by the wings on his hat and the wings on his sandals. This is Hephaestus, the smith god who Hesiod who credits with kind of having the most part in forming Pandora. And then here is the birth of Pandora. She seems to be being born right out of the ground. This is Eros, by the way, who the Romans later called Cupid, god of sex and lust. And she seemed to be born out of the ground. And that's also a very kind of common construct that you see in lots of kind of legends and stories about the birth of humanity, that they are made from the dust of the earth itself. That's a kind of a Jewish and Christian idea, an Islamic idea, that humans are made originally from the stuff of the earth itself, and that seems to be what this face painting suggests. Here's another cup painting. It's been heavily restored, but here we see Pandora, and we have again a couple of deities putting the finishing touches on here. Athena, goddess of craftiness and wisdom and strategy, and then here again Hephaestus here. This is holding his hammer. It's broken here, but he too, the god of craftsmanship, is kind of putting the last touches on Pandora. Now, one last figure I want to mention in all of this, as I guess a kind of silver lining in the bleakness of the story, is the figure of Prometheus. Although this is a pretty bleak picture. Prometheus is a Titan. He's I just mentioned him. He's the brother of Epimetheus. He's the smart brother. He knows the future before it happens. He's also a Titan. He's from the generation before Zeus, and therefore kind of a natural enemy of Zeus. So Prometheus, kind of the most famous part of his story is that he, as he sees Zeus turning against humanity and wanting to blot them out and destroy them, one of the things that Zeus does is he removes fire from humanity. And he thinks, without fire, they can't keep themselves warm, they can't cook, they can't, fire as kind of the spark of technology, they can't, melt metals to make tools. Humanity is stuck, if not doomed, without fire. So Prometheus, wanting to get back at Zeus, steals fire from the heavens and brings it down to humanity. And once the humans have fire, then they start to develop rapidly. And it's after that Zeus has to come up with the next, kind of bullet in his chamber, and that's Pandora. So Zeus famously, when he discovers this betrayal, he captures Prometheus and punishes him brutally. He has him, as this cup painting shows, tied to a post. In other stories, he's kind of impaled through his gut with a kind of a titanium rod. He's kind of pierced to a rock. And then every day this eagle, or in some stories it's a vulture, comes to peck at his heart and his liver. Now Prometheus, this is very indicative of kind of the Greek gods. Prometheus is a god. He's immortal, but he's very, very human at the same time. And so like Zeus too, Zeus can't die technically, but he can suffer like a human. And so here is Prometheus is kind of suffering as a human in this eternal kind of way, this eternal torment. Over here, just incidentally, this is Atlas, another Titan, who is punished by having to hold up the pillars of the earth on his shoulders. You may have heard of him. So this cup painting shows kind of the tortures of two famous Titans, Atlas and Prometheus. Now, where's the silver lining in this that I mentioned? Well, some have compared Prometheus have seen Prometheus as a kind of proto-Christ figure. That is, he is a rare deity that goes out of his way to help humanity, not because humanity has worshipped him and has given him prayers and sacrifices. He does it to help humanity, kind of out of his own pocket, so to speak. And so Prometheus is a god who's on humanity's side. Yeah, maybe. Again, probably from a typical Greek point of view, Prometheus's motives aren't all that altruistic. He doesn't help humanity because he loves humanity. He knows that Zeus is threatened by humanity, and he wants to get back at Zeus. And so he uses humanity as kind of a tool to get back at his rival. I would guess that's probably the primary way a Greek would see it. But nevertheless, there is that other side to it as well. He's a rare god who gives gifts to humanity. All right, last slide here. This is a famous depiction of Prometheus in America. Maybe some of you recognize it. This is 30 Rockefeller Center in downtown Manhattan. There's a famous skating rink in front of it that you'll see on TV at Christmas time and the like. But it's a depiction of Prometheus coming down from heaven. You can see he's got the kind of the tongue of fire in his hand, and he's about to give it to humanity. He's got the circle of the zodiac symbols here that kind of represents the heavens that he's emerging through. And on the back of the wall, you wonder how many thousands of people walk by this every day and never give it a second thought. There's a quote from a Greek poet, Aeschylus, who wrote a famous series of plays about Prometheus as a kind of benefactor of humanity. And the quote, translated here, it's a little bit cut off. It says, "For in every art, he, understood, brought the fire to mortals, comma, a means to mighty ends." And so, the tongue of fire is kind of the spark of technology, the spark of human creativity, the spark of humanity kind of raising themselves up almost to godlike level. And think about where this is, at the base of a massive skyscraper in downtown Manhattan. All of these towers and skyscrapers in Manhattan as kind of, seen through kind of a theological lens, these towers of Babel. It's almost like human beings saying, like, look what we can do. We can literally scrape the sky. We can threaten the heavens with our great inventions. And so I think it's a really kind of brilliant and wonderful kind of fist-shaking use of the imagery of Prometheus as a god helping humanity to become godlike themselves. All right, more to come. Thanks for listening.